Alrighty. So, yeah, basically what I want to go ahead and do is I want to show you guys exactly how I want this CLI interface, which is redundant, command line interface, to work. I want to show you guys how the API is going to work and how to use it, and that's going to be the first thing. So what I want to do is I want to put together a test, and it's just going to be a really straightforward, simple test, and it's not going to compile yet, but we're going to put together the test, and we're going to stub out the command line interface, and we're going to work from there. So you guys get an idea of what's in my mind right now with what I want to accomplish with this little library. And so this will be just a fun little library to put together. It'll be very useful in the future when we start working with different commands that you can send over the wire, over the text box if you're an admin or a game manager or something like that, and stuff and things. And it's going to be very bare bones, very simple. I don't want to spend a whole lot of time on it, but I wrote it in such a way that it will, or thought of it in such a way that it will be fairly extensible in the future, and we should be able to add features to it as we need. Of course, because it's a sort of just a utility library, I definitely want this to be tested properly. So we're going to start off by opening up our tests project under base, and I'm going to right click base, hit add, new item, and let's do a class, and let's go ahead and call this command line interface tests. Okay, so what do I want this class to do? Well, basically, I want this class to be nothing more than something that exposes commands to a text interface. That's really all it does. So we have a text interface that we can type text into, and then those commands that we type in get routed into a particular method. Now, what's the easiest way to do that? Well, I thought about it, and this is the solution I came up with. Basically, the idea is you're going to have these classes, such as test commands. And these classes are going to have methods. So public void command1. And these classes will also have methods that take parameters. Now the idea is what we want to do is we want to be able to pass in an instantiation of this class, or some sort of factory for this class, into an object and have it take this class and turn it into something that can be invoked from the command line. And everything else will be handled through magic. Now, it's not going to be very difficult to do this. This is going to be a pretty straightforward library. So what I'm going to do here is I'm going to go ahead and write a test. I want to write the test so we get an end-to-end use case, or a couple end-to-end use cases of how this is going to work. So in order to test this, basically, I'm going to want to make sure that this class has these methods get invoked when I type in the right commands, is basically the end-to-end test for this library. So the easiest way to do that is by putting in a count. So I'm going to say public int command1 call count, get private set. Then I'm going to have a public int command2 call count, get private set. But I'm also going to have a public string command2 param1, get private set, and a public int command2 param2, get private set. Of course, the command1 method is simply going to increment command1 call count, and command2 is simply going to increment command2 call count and set command2 param1 to param1 and command2 param2 to param2. So this is our command class. It doesn't do anything useful other than record what was invoked, but of course that's enough. That's all we need at this point in order to properly test it. So yeah, now the question is how do we use the command line interface class? Now that we have our command class created, let's go ahead and write our tests. So I'm going to go ahead and say test. Also, by the way, I got an NUnit framework up there. I'm also going to add the test fixture attribute to my class as well, just to be explicit. NUnit doesn't really care if you throw test fixture onto it, but I prefer to have it there. I just also want to point out, I don't think I mentioned this in the last couple of videos, I am now using Visual Studio Community 2013. So I am now using the free version of Visual Studio 2013 that is released. So yeah, if you're not using that, and you haven't already bought Visual Studio 2013 Professional, then I highly recommend grabbing Visual Studio Community 2013. Also, we will be upgrading to Unity 5 at some point soon, but that's going to be a really straightforward process because there's not a whole lot to upgrade. All right, anyway, so yeah, grab 2013 Community if you can, or just do it anyway because it's better. And I've also upgraded to ReSharper 9, so that's why my IntelliSense looks a little different than it did in the last videos. Okay, so we have our test, our first test. The first test is going to be, I'm so bad at coming up with test names. CLI, well, I don't have to put CLI, that'd be redundant. Can invoke commands without parameters. Or how about without arguments? That would be more. Either one would work. Okay, so can invoke commands without arguments. So how do we bootstrap our command line interface? And how do we invoke it? So again, I'm just making stuff up. I'm just throwing code out there that won't compile because these classes don't exist yet. But I just want to get an idea of how I want to work with this API. So this is a really good way to come up with a good, easy way, or words and words and words. This is a good way to figure out the design of your API before you start building it, basically. So I'm going to start off with the instantiation of a object I'm going to refer to as CLI, and it's going to be a type of command line interface. Okay, so then what I want to do is I want to go ahead and say, I need a way to register this class with this CLI object so that this CLI object is aware of all the commands that can be invoked on this class. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to say CLI dot, I'll just do, how about register command object? I don't know if I like that name. I might change it in the future. And then I'm going to pass in a lambda that simply instantiates a new test commands. So why am I doing this? So basically, this line of code, in my head, what it's going to do is it's going to take the type I just instantiated through that lambda, scan it for all the different methods that it can expose, and then when those commands are invoked, it'll invoke this lambda to get the instance of the object that it needs to work. Now, why am I doing it that way? Well, I wanted to support or have this plug in to an IOC framework such as AutoFac, and doing it this way will make that very easy. Instead of passing in a lambda, I would pass in something like container dot resolve test commands. You know, if I wanted to use AutoFac instead or any other container, I could do it because the factory for instantiating this object is the lambda. So I could have it instantiate a new test commands every time a command is invoked. I could have it not do that. I could pass in a closure as well and have it be the same instance of test commands every time it's invoked any way that I want to do it. So it gives me a lot more flexibility by passing in a lambda as opposed to passing in a factory as opposed to passing in a instantiated object. Gives me much more flexibility. Okay, oh yeah, this won't work, will it? Because I actually need to get a reference back to this object in order to verify that command 1 call count and command 2 call count were changed. So, let's go ahead and turn this into a singleton. What I'm going to do is I'm going to say var test commands equals new test commands. And then I'm going to change this closure. I'm going to change this to a closure that simply hoists this local variable up. So now, every time a command comes in for this command fixture, it'll always use the same instance of that object, test commands. Okay, so yeah. So now that I have my command object registered, what would it look like to actually invoke it? Well, since I really want to plug this into a command line tool, it would make sense to make the API for this compatible, at least initially compatible, with the string array, the argument array that's passed in from the environment. So maybe in the future we'll also support just passing in a straight string and we'll do our own parsing. But for now, I see this being used right now just with a console application. So what I want is I want to pass in an array of strings and have that array of strings be routed to the proper command. So what I want is CLI.execute command or how about just execute, and I'm going to pass in a string array. And so in this case, I'm going to pass in test commands, command1. So basically, the idea would be if I went on to my command line, like my actual CMD, and actually invoked an executable. So it'd be like something.exe test commands command1. That command line will invoke this method on that object, is what I want. Anyway, so then what I want is I want test commands dot command1 call count should be 1. Okay, so let's go ahead and do another test. I'm going to say public void can invoke commands with arguments. I'm going to say var CLI. No, that's not how you spell CLI. Spell CLI. Command line interface. Var test commands equals new test commands. Wow, I totally could have used the setup and method to do this instead, but I guess I won't. Register command object test commands. Okay, so what's it going to look like when I execute a command that has arguments? Well, basically, this command has a string param1 and an int param2. So I'm going to say test commands for the class command2, and then I'm going to say actually I'm going to declare these as constant. I'll say const string param1 equals param1 and const int param2 equals 1 2 3 4, and then I'm going to pass these constants into the string array. Of course, param2 is going to have to be converted into a string. Then I'm going to say test commands dot command2 call count should be 1, and test commands dot command2 param1 should be param1, and test commands command param2 should be param2. And those are our 2 tests. So we'll have more tests in the future. I definitely want to be able to test error conditions. That being said, I wrote these tests specifically to show you guys what I have in my mind for the end product. There's going to be a couple intermediate steps for putting this together, but at the end of the day, this is what I want it to look like. Okay, so what I'm going to do now is I guess I can go ahead and stub out the API. It's really going to be pretty straightforward. There's only a couple classes. So I think what I'm going to do is I'm going to stub everything out and stub out the classes as well as the public methods, and then we'll start building each component bit by bit using proper testing. So this is going to live in our buzzmmo.base assembly under infrastructure, and I'm going to go ahead and place it into another namespace called CLI. I really should start organizing things by namespace a little bit better that I've been doing, and I'll start with this. Maybe in the future we'll have a video where I go through and refactor all the namespaces that I currently have to make it more consistent. But anyway, we'll go ahead and put everything that we want in the command line interface in the CLI namespace here. And we'll just start writing stuff. So the first thing that I need to write is the command... Well, actually, I'll start with what makes sense logically. We'll get some compiler errors along the way, but it'll make more sense the way I'm going through this. Again, I'm stubbing out classes and public methods. So, the first class that I want to go ahead and put together is the command line interface class. And this class is, not surprisingly, the class that we instantiated, the kind of the entry point to this whole subsystem. Now that I've done that, after I've created this class, I am going to jump back over into my tests and then import the buzzmmo base infrastructure CLI namespace as well, simply by clicking on that tooltip. So that just brings this up there to the top. And so this file will have fewer and fewer errors as we go along. Okay, so the command line interface, what's that going to look like? Well, basically, we're going to have our register command object method. So it's going to be a public void register command object. It's going to be a generic method, and it's going to accept the func of t and this is going to be called the instance factory. So the register command object method takes in our instance factory, and it will get the type from, it'll infer the type from the function's return type. Now, why am I making this a generic type as opposed to, well, there's really no other way to do this. The reason I need to make this a generic type and have it like this is I need the type of the object that's going to be instantiated by instance factory. And by using type inference, generic type inference, I'm able to basically extract the type that's returned by that funct into a type parameter that I'll be able to use to determine what type was passed in without actually invoking the instance factory until I need it. Next up, I don't want all the commands to be command objects. That's going to be one way to register commands, but I want there to be another way to register commands for things like maybe dynamic commands that are created or generated for in some way. So what I want to do is I want to say a public void. I want to say register command, have an actual register command class, and it's going to take in 3 parameters. It's going to have the group, the name, and a command object. Now, the group is kind of the namespace of the command. The name is the name of the command itself, and then the command object itself is responsible for the logic of that command being invoked. We'll stub out the command object as well here pretty soon. And then finally, what we'll need is a public void execute command method, which takes in a string array of arguments. So that's really the public interface for our command line interface. I'm sure we'll need some helper methods here in the future. We'll probably need a constructor, but this is good for right now, just so you guys know where I'm going with this. All right, now that we've done that, the next logical thing to do would be to implement or stub out our command class. So our command class is interesting. Really, it's only responsible for containing the actual logic for a command, but it's also used to describe the command itself. Now you'll see what I mean by that here in a second. I'm going to go ahead and create a new class, and it's going to be called command, not surprisingly. And it's going to be abstract, first of all. And then it's going to have, basically, it's going to have a public void execute command arguments. And then it's also going to have, I forgot, public IEnumerable of a command parameters. Okay, so what's going on here? So the command is going to be an abstract class. It has a method called execute. Pretty straightforward, right? The other thing, though, to look at this is notice how execute is getting a reference to a command arguments class, as opposed to our command line interface accepting a string array. That's because of this right here, the public IEnumerable of command parameters. A command is responsible for describing its parameters to the CLI. Why? The reason is so that the CLI class, the command line interface class, can actually take whatever it gets, be it a string or an array of strings, and convert it into the type that is required by the command. So the command object is going to get the actually properly instantiated full objects, whereas the command line interface class is only going to get a string array. And the command line interface class is going to basically ask the command class about its parameters, do the proper type conversions, and then pass it into the command class in the form of command arguments. Okay, so let's go ahead and do our command parameter. This class I'm not going to stub out. I'm just going to write the entire thing. So I'm going to say command parameter. And this class is going to be a simple DTO. It's going to have a type parameter type, a string name, and an int order. And it's going to go ahead and do that. And we're going to make sure these are all set to private sets. Okay, so what's going on here? We have a command parameter DTO. It describes a parameter to a command. That's all it does. In this case, it has a name and an order and a type. Well, we're not going to be using the name for anything yet, but I'd put that in there for the future, because you see here in our tests, right now we have it accepting a string array, and the parameters are only ordered. I want to also support syntax that allows you to name parameters. I also, in the future, want to be able to deal with optional or required parameters, and maybe even also support things like help text and all that fun stuff. That's why we need this command parameter DTO. We can extend it in the future to support more data, but for now, this is the minimum amount of data that it needs in order to fulfill what we need to do. So that's our command parameter. Now let's go ahead and take a look at our command arguments. So if you recall from just a second ago, the command arguments class is responsible for encapsulating the arguments that were passed in. Oh, by the way, if this wasn't clear, some people think that parameter and argument mean the same thing, and I really want to point out the distinction between the two things, because it's incredibly important to understand the distinction between the word parameter and argument if you're going to follow along with what we're working on with this command line interface, especially when you see things like command arguments here, but then we have parameters here. Well, this is a good example of the difference between the term parameter and an argument. A parameter is the description of a value that a function can receive. You can think of a parameter as something that exists at compile time. For example, this, what I have highlighted right now, is a parameter, because this is just an abstract concept of a method that can exist and it can take something. And the parameter is the description of what data can this method receive. An argument, on the other hand, is what is actually passed in to a method. So, for example, this is an argument. So this is the actual data that's being passed into a method. So that's an argument, but that's a parameter. So this is a parameter named arguments, and these are the arguments that are passed into the parameter that is also named arguments. So it can get a little confusing because of what we're working with here, but it's important to understand the distinction because, for example, think for a second why I named this my command parameters, but this my command arguments. Because this describes the command in a general sense. It describes the structure of the command in a static sense. Whereas this describes the values that were actually passed into this method and the values that we're going to extract and use to do whatever we need to do. So that's the difference between the two. Okay, so our command arguments class is responsible for holding the values that were passed at runtime into this particular command. So let's go ahead and back into our CLI namespace. I'm going to go ahead and create a new class called command arguments. Now the command arguments class is going to basically, it's going to have a couple methods, or sorry, one method that we're going to use to as a factory. Words aren't working right now, so let's just show you code. Public static command arguments from string array, string arguments, IEnumerable of command parameters. Okay, so what's going on here? Well, here, by the way, I'm going to return null here because we're stubbing things out, and I want to make sure this code still compiles. So I need to return null because this method returns the value. Anyway, this is going to be a basic convenience factory method. And this factory method is basically going to be responsible for converting the string array representation of arguments into an instantiation of the command arguments class. Now I'm doing it as a factory method because this method may throw an exception. I'm also doing it as factory method to make it clear between this and any other factory methods that we might want to write. For example, like I said in the future, not all of our CLI arguments are going to come in the form of a string array. In the future, when we implement this, the command line interface for our chat system, it's going to come in as just a single string. So we're going to need another method to do the proper conversion from that into this representation. So this method will be responsible for extracting the arguments out of the arguments array and converting it to the proper values, and then returning a command arguments object. However, it will throw an exception if certain things don't work. If, for example, you didn't pass in the right arguments, you didn't pass in a required argument, or you didn't pass in the right type of argument, and then it'll throw an exception at this point. And it's generally considered bad form to throw exceptions in constructors, so that is the second reason why I wanted to make sure that this is a factory method and not a constructor. Anyway, so what else do we have here? We're going to need a count. So basically, how many arguments do we have? We're going to need a construct roll. Yeah, we're going to write a constructor. We're basically going to write a constructor that takes in an object of arguments. And then we're going to have a public t get int position, return default t, oops, and a public object get int position, return null, and a public object array to array, return null. Okay, so basically our command arguments class is a wrapper around a object array. So why are we even bothering writing this? Well, this is one of the ways that I'm trying to make this a little bit more future-proof. Because in the future, I want you to not only be able to get an argument by its position, but also by name. So this command arguments class just kind of abstracts away the whole concept of command arguments. And yeah, so it's basically just a glorified array at this point. But in the future, that will change. So that's why I wanted to make sure that this was its own separate class. And anyway, regardless, the code required to convert from the string array into the command arguments is actually very important code, and I found that this was a really good place for this code to be. It has its own little home that makes sense. Okay, I guess we have... I want to go ahead and... Let's go ahead and write our method command. So I'm going to say method command. What's a method command? Well, a method command is going to be a class that inherits from command, the abstract command class. And then what it's going to do is it's going to have a constructor that takes a method info method and the func of object instance factory. So a method command is going to be a command that's instantiated that represents the invocation of a method on an object. The last thing I wanted to go ahead and do, just because we're in here, we're writing a bunch of classes, just get the final class out of the way. We haven't seen this referenced yet, but we will in the future here. And that is, I'm going to go ahead and write an attribute called CLI name attribute. And it's going to inherit from attribute. And I'm going to go ahead and just implement this entire attribute because it's really simple. So it's going to inherit from attribute. It's going to have a attribute usage of class and method. And it's going to have an allow multiple of false, which I do believe is the default, but whatever. And then we'll have a string name, which will be an auto property. So what's going on here? This is just basically a way that we're going to use to override the name of the class or the methods of particular commands. But yeah, so that's basically the CLI in a nutshell. That's all stubbed out. We can start writing tests now against all of these things and start implementing all of these individual components bit by bit and make sure that we have proper tests for all of them. So again, it's really important, especially since I'm going to be expanding on this in the future, expanding on this little command line thing in the future. I definitely want a strong suite of tests to make sure that I don't have any regressions. It seems that I have a typo here. CLI.execute. Oh, I have execute command. I meant to make this just execute on the command line interface. So go back into your command line interface class and change it to just execute. Now the code compiles, but if I were to go ahead and run it, you'll notice that we get 2 failed tests. which is exactly what we want here, because we haven't written anything yet. All right, I think that'll wrap up this video. In the next video, we will... the first thing I want to do is I want to implement my command arguments class, because this is such a self-contained class. We'll go ahead and write some tests and implement this in the next video. So we'll see you guys later.